Welcome to our JavaScript web course. In this video, we will look at some additional methods and properties that are available to us via the document object model. I will point out some of the more commonly used methods and properties when working with the web page. I would like to provide a little background. In the early days of JavaScript, there was no document object model. We had what is called the browser object model. And we had methods and properties that pertain to objects such as the window, the history, location, navigator screen. We also worked with the document, but we could only access certain elements on the document and write to the page in a very primitive manner. These browser objects still exist, and some of their methods and properties are covered in this chapter. We also have built-in JavaScript objects. We've already looked at the array object, several more objects throughout the rest of this course. We will not be covering user-defined objects. So to refresh, the document object model refers to the hierarchical relationship between the elements on the page. Elements typically contain elements which contain other elements, which give us a parent-child sibling relationship. Based on those relationships, we can reference or return an element on the page for purposes of accessing it using JavaScript in order to perform some type of interaction. These are some of the more commonly used traditional document properties here. Unfortunately, the last modified is no longer supported. The referrer returns the page where the user came from. This is useful in statistics. Document.url and location are very similar, except that location can be used to redirect a page. We also can return the title, and you're all familiar with the write method. We will now cover some additional methods that allow us to reference or return an element or elements. We have been using getElementsById for quite some time. I would like to now introduce getElementsByTagName. That means that we can reference an individual element or a collection of elements by identifying that tag name. We can also do this with the class name, getElementsByClassName. getElementsByName is only used with form elements because form elements have a name attribute, and the only elements that would have a common name attribute would be radio buttons or checkboxes. querySelector and querySelector all allows us to access either the first element or all of the elements that match a CSS selector. I have files for all of these methods, so I will not be reviewing them in this video. I would like to point out how to use getElementsByTagName for returning a single element. This is a collection or an array. If we look at the HTML here, I have 4 paragraphs. If we wanted to reference the first one using getElementsByTagName, we would add the index position of 0 next to the method. It is really impossible to put an ID in every time you want to access an element. It just doesn't work well, and it's very inefficient. Now, if we wanted to access all of the elements, and here I have an unordered list example, you would need to use a for loop. We learned that for loops work well with arrays. Well, this collection is an array. It is 0-based, and we can determine the length. So it is very easy for us to loop through this collection of HTML elements for the purposes of doing something to each element. I would also like to explain querySelector method, which also applies to querySelector all, to separate it from the other methods we have learned. The querySelector method will return the first match and the first match only. querySelector all will return everything that matches. What we pass to this method is a CSS selector. Please take a look at what I have here. If you were using getElementById or getElementsByClassName, you would not be actually using the selector. You would be using the value of the ID or class. So just think to yourself, how would I do this in CSS? If you can determine that selector, you can use it here with JavaScript. We also have some very useful DOM properties returning or referencing elements based on the parent-child sibling relationship. And I have an example in another video. We also have some very nice methods that allow us to manipulate attributes. We can check to see if the attribute exists. We can set an attribute value. We can remove it, and we can return it for purposes of comparison. Changing the attributes, especially if it's a class attribute, allows us to manipulate the document and create interactivity. Finally, we have the ability to actually create elements and create text and to append that text to an element. And I have a video and file to demonstrate this.